Welcome to Harlow on Healthcare. I'm David Harlow, and I invite you to join me by my virtual hearth as I sit down with healthcare leaders to discuss building the future of healthcare. Today, my guest is Kevin Phillips, Vice President, Product Management and Marketing of Capsule. Capsule provides medical device integration, clinical surveillance, and patient monitoring for healthcare organizations with an eye to supporting collaboration, communication, and satisfaction through improved data management and connectivity. Welcome, Kevin, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for the opportunity to be here.
So, Kevin, there's a lot of talk about interoperability in healthcare IT circles, which has culminated in the famous final rules, though that's really focused on electronic health record interoperability. The work that Capsule does involves interoperability of a different sort, though. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, happy to. Capsule was founded over 20 years ago by a few software developers that came out of a perioperative EMR organization that they were at the time writing some specific interfaces to get data from devices to power their application, all with the objective of how do we simplify workflow for the end provider. And they realized early on that each device had its own proprietary communication protocol. So over the past 20 years, we've focused on working with virtually any device that is found around the patient bedside, working with the medical device manufacturer, and we write specific interfaces to each of those communication protocols from each of those devices. And then we abstract that within our system and then can manage that data in any way with any specific output protocol. Primarily today, we've aligned it to the IHE interoperability standards of HL7 with a variety of profiles around EMR integration, alarm management, surveillance, and waveforms that allow us to be interoperable with multiple different end systems. So certainly when we think about the requirements today to share data freely, we couldn't agree more with the intent to make data accessible for all. And really that's core to our mission, which is to enable data to be available for and accessible by clinicians to impact patient care. But interesting. I mean, it hasn't been something that's new for us. It's been one that we've been doing for well over 20 years at this point.
Great. What I'm visualizing is sort of old school. Every device in the hospital that is wirelessly enabled has its own receiver, receives information, and what you've done is sort of integrate all of that so that information can come through a single pipe, so to speak, and then be distributed wherever that information needs to go.
Correct. And, initially, our system was viewed somewhat as a translation engine. And the core value was based upon, each device has its own language. And we're the Rosetta Stone that allows us to communicate with all of them in a way that every end system can understand. And that's still true. I mean, many devices still have their own unique communication protocol, but that's certainly improved over the years as standards and each IHE profiles have been more readily adopted. The bigger demands, and now that's certainly a key achievement. But now clients are looking to how do we do something meaningful with that data for multiple endpoints? And it was originally just documentation. And so now how do we manage this that's unique for each end system? And due to the increased drive to have, near real-time visibility and access to some of this data, you need to get data directly at that source. So, but yes.
So you're talking about care management, using the data in real time for care management?
Well, in part, I mean, a good example is the distinction between documentation and broad surveillance of the patient. So today, our system is predominantly, historically, been used to acquire data and automate the patient record. And so instead of the nurse going into the room every 15 minutes to chart data around all the device data around that patient record and then go back to their clinical workstation and enter that in manually, just getting data posted over every minute and then reviewed, validated system is sufficient. But when you think about, especially as the need for remote visibility on some of these critical patients where decline can happen quickly, just getting data once a minute, once every 15 minutes isn't sufficient. So the ability to identify, rapid changes in the patient physiology and being able to send that and use that over to, plan for that care for the patient in each of those shifts. But if there is something urgent, seconds matter. And so that's where the need to capture that data as quickly as possible from each of these devices and then manage it and harness it for each of the different use cases or systems that we're integrating to is key. So that's where it's not just the translation part of interoperability that's critical, but doing so in a way that allows us to manage the relevant data elements for each system and workflow as well.
Could you put a little more color on that? Maybe some real life examples of how that continuous surveillance works in the real world?
Happily. So, so I think the clinical documentation workflow is quite self-evident. If we think about the history of alarm management, though, there's been phases of adoption. The first was, there was the scenario of how do we have quiet patient rooms. So there was patients that had the doors were closed, patient alarms were not heard out of the central nursing stations, and unfortunately, sentinel events occurred. So there was a big wave to push, to connect these monitors and all other devices, so that alarms could be heard, enunciate remotely. And then from that, we saw a wave of alarm fatigue because there's hundreds of alarms coming off around each of these devices in the patient room. And now propagating those out to the assigned clinician led to another scenario of 85 to 95% of those alarms are not clinically actionable. So phase 2 was certainly national patient safety goals, where hospitals had to have clear guidelines for how they standardize their alarms and ensuring a safe and effective use of those in practice. And there was a wave of additional middleware vendors that were looking to have additional filters, delays on those alarms to reduce the propensity of alarms being sent to the assigned clinician. But still, we see the majority of the alarm fatigue issue has not occurred and has not improved. And so, surveys over the past 12 years highlight that actually alarm fatigue has almost even gotten worse, not better. So the approach that we're taking and what distinguishes our view of surveillance versus alarm management is actually having full visibility, and we're interrogating all data directly from all devices that are connected to that patient. And by being able to view data, we can create combinations of alarms that have a much more sensitive and specific view of that patient situation, so that we're seeing a dramatic reduction in the number of false alarms that are being triggered to that end clinician. So that's really the distinction, that we're not just looking at individual alarm thresholds where they broke it or not, but having full visibility on all data from the monitor of the vent. We have dialysis machines that are connected in these rooms, beds, are now medical devices, and having a full visibility, you're able to create much more sophisticated notifications around that patient decline. And that's really the trajectory that we're moving towards, is how do we simplify that workflow for the clinician? And once they are driven a tap on the shoulder that, look, this patient is going in the wrong direction, that they have actionable insights to be able to make that informed decision.
Actionable insights, and I imagine some of these, the parameters for alarms can be tweaked by a particular clinician or team so that they get exactly what they're looking for, rather than, again, speaking to alarm fatigue, just get the alarms they need.
Correct. And, sometimes it's easy if a patient was fully connected to a critical care monitor. We have a lot of data points to interrogate, and you have, different ways to actually understand if one signal, if the SpO2 sensor is falling off the patient's finger, but we're seeing other aspects, we can identify if that's an artifact or not. It's harder when the patient is just being measured on a pulse oximeter device, and you just have one signal coming from that patient. So it's really understanding for each hospital, each department, each set of patient populations, how do they intend to care for those patients, and how do we design a program that's relevant for them? It's unfortunately, there's not a one size fits all approach that meets each client's clinical workflow needs.
Does this enable people to set up programs that would allow for monitoring not just at the unit desk, so to speak, at the nurse's station, but more remotely, or, for example, dealing with patients in isolation, or dealing with a central hub that can provide specialty care to facilities throughout a network?
Definitely. One of our large university health systems is actually leveraging this to assist in their ICU staff in off hours. So they've designed a remote ICU bunker so they're using it from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., where they don't have the same intensivist staff. And so there's extra eyes on that patient's full visibility around all data that's occurring around that patient's, smart alarm notifications are being triggered to that remote bunker. And then they can start to manage their capacity planning for, listen, is the patient going south? And yet again, if the on-site clinician is not aware of that, they have the ability to go and communicate directly to that individual. And so now you see a way where they can start to manage their clinicians in a way that meet a broader network of patients. So efficiency and safety goes up by having that broader view of the patient in a continuous way. So definitely, and we're seeing now, even with scenarios in the current scenario where ICUs are being expanded due to the COVID-19 pandemic, where there's, ventilated patients that are in areas of the hospital that were never initially intended to be managed in that way. So how do you expand capacity? So our core connectivity solution is being brought into these makeshift ICU rooms. We're connecting new vents that are, they're required from other organizations, old ones. And yet again, because we've been around for 20 years, we have the opportunity to have communication protocols for a lot of these old vents too, that could be easily connected up into a centralized infrastructure. And then we have a surveillance cockpit that provides that trained clinician the ability to have full eyes on that patient. And with that and the smart alerts and notifications, they're able to prioritize which patients need notification and removes them from having to go and see every patient every time an alarm is notified. So they have a much more higher visibility on how to care for a wider set of patients in these scenarios.
If you're just tuning in, this is Harlow on Healthcare, coming to you on Healthcare Now Radio. I'm David Harlow, and my guest today is Kevin Phillips, VP Product Management and Marketing of Capsule. Kevin, we talk a little bit about monitoring from afar, and you referred to the idea of a bunker, a remote bunker that could sort of have visibility into an ICU or a broader range of units. Have you run in, or have your customers run into a negative reaction to the sort of big brother-ish approach, having someone looking over your shoulder if you're the clinician on the front line?
It's a good question. No, and I think it's partly given the scenario of, really it's an additional set of eyes, a safety blankets for both ends of the spectrum. It's for the frontline workers knowing that, listen, their day is filled with a series of interrupt-driven tasks. And so they're managing maybe a bunch of different patients at once. They're dealing with their family members. They're the clinicians to manage those patients. And so knowing that at every point in time, that if something is urgent and requires their immediate attention, that they're going to be driven a notification not only to themselves, but a secondary care provider gives them a sense of confidence that the patients that they're responsible for are being cared for appropriately. And also, from certainly the hospital leadership and the members of the trained clinicians that are part of this surveillance. And there's a distinction between monitoring in the room, that is the class 2 device, versus the class 2 patient surveillance, secondary, notifications of that patient data, where we're identifying those triggers of decline, informing the assigned clinician, and then they're going back into the room, assessing that patient condition and the primary devices in that room. So we really don't see it from the clinicians, the clients that have deployed our system, they see it as an assist solution for them. And really, unlike most other technologies where there's high resistance from clinicians, that because we make their job more challenging, additional clicks, additional steps, things that make their life harder. Our core medical device information platform that streamlines the whole data acquisition process in the patient room, to streamlining how that's being driven and the insights to that key clinician. We're actually removing a dramatic number of steps in that whole process, reducing the impact of fatigue. And so we're seeing actually a high satisfaction level of when our system is deployed. And so today we see 17 of the top 20 hospitals by use in Newsworld report that deploy our system in the United States are using our system because they see it as critical to delivering safe and effective care. So we haven't heard that pushback to date.
Okay. And so you've given a snapshot of a metric there. How broadly are your systems used in the U.S. and elsewhere, if you could give us a sense of that?
Yeah, we were over 2,800 facilities globally, 2,100 in the United States, a little over 100. The whole province of Alberta has just recently deployed our system in Canada, so we're seeing a broad deployment there. But interestingly, we're a 300-person organization. Our development headquarters is in Paris, France, and it's actually where it was originally founded out of. So at the roots of who we are, we're an international global organization. So we're in 38 different countries, primarily Europe, but we're seeing broad growth, Asia Pacific, Middle East, and in parts of South America as well. Broadly aligned to there's a good correlation between, as EMRs are becoming more prolific in these areas, the demand for getting real-time data into their system is a key driver. So, but today we're in most U.S. hospitals, they have some aspect of getting device data into their in their clinical systems, but most now are looking more holistically throughout every area of their healthcare facility and even outpatient facilities. Let's just not connect monitors, which is typically the first device, but all devices around that patient. And until you have full visibility, it's hard to really manage the entire, patient's experiences. So, a little over 2,100 in the United States.
Great. So as you connect more and more devices, obviously there's more and more potential points of failure. And I come at this from the direction of sort of health policy and healthcare innovation, but also data privacy and data security. And I'm wondering if you could speak to cybersecurity vulnerabilities in the medical device world. Every time Microsoft declares end of life for one of its operating systems, there's always a flurry of stories about how now there's another X thousand or million medical devices out there that are going to be more vulnerable than they were yesterday. Just wondering how you see that issue across the ecosystem of different devices in hospitals or other clinical settings.
It's a great question, and one that we see. I would say 10 years ago, security was a topic of discussion, but now it is a critical part of every new client encounter we have, and for good reason. The security threats that we're seeing are going up consistently. And so a few thoughts on this. One, medical devices have an extremely long lifespan. We're still seeing devices that were made in the early 90s in use. And we have the privilege and the responsibility connecting to these devices and getting them up onto the hospital network. But devices developed 20 years ago did not have cybersecurity in mind when they were built. So it's a critical responsibility we have to any device that we connect to. Security at the edge is of paramount concern. And there's virtually every one of our large academic hospitals today are evaluating ways that, how they can ensure those devices are secured. So what we've built in really a series of releases over the past decade is, security by design. So the hub that we have deployed in the patient room, they're referred to as the capsule neuron, is encrypted at at rest and in transit. So really any part of data that's coming out of that device is encrypted as it gets up to our centralized server and then managed behind the hospital firewall to ensure that it is safe and PHI data is protected. But it is, if you look at some other major medical device manufacturers recently, they've issued a series of vulnerability notices where just getting data out of that device without thinking about how it's going to transition onto that hospital network has highlighted in some very public, sharing of those concerns. But so yes, cybersecurity is a major topic that we're seeing in our healthcare systems today.
Okay. So, yeah, and it sounds like you're helping hospitals pull data together behind their own firewalls, whether that's on premises or cloud. And I'm wondering whether there's any sort of aggregation across hospital systems that you're doing for analytics of any sort, or is everything sort of held uniquely for each client separately?
It's a great question. Actually, there is a whole new segment that is sort of the healthcare system or the healthcare ecosystem that's being born out of this IoT security space. And there's a variety of vendors that we work with on that topic. Today, our core solution is primarily it is stored within either the hospital premise, data center, and we're now starting to see managed the Capsule Medical Device Information Platform in the cloud as well, but we're not sharing data between systems, de-identified data to date. But I think that's certainly an opportunity as we move forward, is identifying those threats and being able to identify those signatures of threats and being able to notify clients that these are devices that are potential security risks and alerting them to those points. A few years ago, we have released a solution that allows us to have full visibility, all devices that are connected to our network. So we know every time a device is connected, disconnected, where it's been last connected into the system. So we do provide full visibility of all devices that are connected to our platform, and everything that's being passed through our system is secure. And we're continuing to work and partner with these broader IoT security companies that have the visibility of connecting to all devices, phones, PCs, and ensuring that, collaboratively we can provide hospitals with full visibility on their devices and potential security hazards they possess as they're all connected onto their hospital network.
So, Kevin, to wrap things up, I wanted to ask you, if you were to wake up tomorrow and find yourself 5 years in the future, what's one thing in healthcare that you would hope or expect to find has changed drastically?
I think the biggest area for enhancement we can make is giving full visibility around the patient to clinicians. Today, even while we've made tremendous progress over the past 20 years as a healthcare ecosystem, the fact that there's still manual steps to chart, there's no visibility on patients in many departments and hospitals around what's happening on that patient at that given period of time, I think limits the ability for our health system to scale, limits our healthcare system's ability to reduce fatigue and the stress on our clinicians, and it reduces the ability for our health systems to provide safe and effective care. So in 5 years, I would expect to see a fully connected health ecosystem that allows for automated documentation from all devices, full visibility around that patient, identifying deterioration, and ultimately allows patients to get out of the hospital safer than they would otherwise. So fully connected, I think, is given the pace of adoption, I think is achievable within the next 5 years.
Okay, we'll all plug in, tune in, and turn on. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, David. It's been a pleasure.
You have been listening to Harlow on Healthcare. Join us at healthcarenowradio.com. Let's continue the conversation on building the future of healthcare together at #HarlowOnHC. I'm David Harlow, keeping the fire going and holding a seat open for you. Until next time.